"Don't look there," the rancher stared, and froze in shock. Wild West stories. His ranch lay at the edge of a small Wild West town, surrounded by rolling hills and dense forests. Life was simple here, but it was hard. Each day was a battle against the land, the weather, and sometimes the animals he raised. Still, John loved it. There was a freedom in the wide-open spaces that no town, no matter how busy, could ever give him. He stepped out of his small wooden house and breathed deeply. The smell of the earth, mixed with the faint aroma of smoke from the fireplace, filled his lungs. Around him, the cattle stirred in the pasture. A few cows were grazing lazily, while calves huddled close to their mothers, occasionally nuzzling them for warmth. John loved these animals. To him, they were more than property. They were companions, silent witnesses to his long, solitary life. His day always began with the same routine. First, he checked the fences. The wooden barriers were old, battered by storms and sun, but they held mostly. John carried a hammer and some nails with him as he walked the long lines of timber. He tapped the wood here and there, replacing a broken post or tightening a loose plank. The sound of the hammer striking the wood echoed faintly across the pasture. It was a sound John found comforting. Each strike was a reminder that he was protecting what he had built with his own hands. As he worked, he noticed the familiar signs of wildlife. Deer tracks in the soft mud near the creek, the faint scratch of a fox in the underbrush, birds flying low over the fields. Sometimes he would pause and watch the horizon, where the hills met the sky, just to remind himself how vast the world really was. Living on the ranch meant learning patience. One had to notice the small things, the little changes in the land or the animals. That awareness was what kept a man alive out here. By mid-morning, the sun had climbed higher, and the wind had begun to pick up. John took a break under the shade of an old oak tree near the edge of the pasture. He wiped the sweat from his forehead and sipped water from a tin cup. The simple act of drinking water felt like a small luxury out here. The land demanded respect, but it also offered small comforts to those who lived close to it. John leaned back against the tree and allowed himself a moment of rest. He thought about the town he lived near, though he rarely went there. The small cluster of wooden buildings, the dusty streets, and the few merchants who sold supplies, it all seemed so far away from the life he led. He had come to the town only when necessary, preferring the quiet of his ranch to the noise of people. Yet he knew the town was important. If anything went wrong, if a storm damaged the fences or an accident happened with the cattle, he would need neighbors he could trust. For now, though, the ranch was his world, and he was content in it. After his short rest, John returned to work. He moved among the cattle, checking their health. He knew each animal by sight. He noticed when a cow limped slightly, when a calf was weaker than the others, or when an older animal seemed to lose interest in eating. John cared for his herd carefully, giving each one attention as if it were a person. The animals responded to him as well. When he approached, they would nuzzle him gently, recognizing the familiar human in their midst. The morning passed slowly but productively. By late morning, John had repaired several fences, checked the water troughs, and ensured that the cattle were safe and comfortable. The sun was high in the sky now, casting golden light over the hills. Shadows stretched long across the fields, and the wind whispered through the tall grass. John paused again, looking out over the land he had worked so hard to maintain. This was his life. It was simple, yes, but it was honest. He had no wealth, no grand possessions, but he had the land, the animals, and his freedom. That, to him, was worth more than anything money could buy. Lunch was a simple affair. John had brought a small pack with bread, cheese, and a piece of salted meat. He ate slowly, enjoying the quiet sounds around him, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a hawk, the low murmur of his cattle. He thought about the work that still needed to be done. There was always work on a ranch, mending fences, clearing brush, feeding animals, tending to sick ones, and planning for the future. But John did not mind. Each task was a challenge, and each challenge he met strengthened him. As the day went on, John noticed the subtle changes in the sky. Clouds were gathering in the distance, the edges tinged with gray. A storm might be coming. He made a mental note to secure the animals in the lower pasture, closer to the barn. The land could be unpredictable, and weather was one of its fiercest challenges. John had learned over the years to read the sky like a book, noticing small signs that others might miss. The smell of rain in the air, the direction of the wind, the way the animals behaved, all these things told a story if you knew how to listen. By mid-afternoon, the sun began to wane, and the temperature dropped slightly. John walked along the fence line once more, inspecting the repairs he had made. He could hear the faint sound of water from a distant creek, birds calling to one another, and the occasional snap of a twig as a deer moved through the brush. Despite the hard work, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The ranch was alive with activity, and he had played his part in keeping it that way. As evening approached, John returned to his small house. The wooden floorboards creaked beneath his boots. He set down his tools and started a fire in the hearth. The warmth was comforting after a long day outdoors. He prepared a simple meal of beans and bread, sitting at the small wooden table and reflecting on the day. Life was hard, but it was also rewarding. Every day brought a sense of accomplishment, no matter how small. He knew that when he went asleep, he would do so with the knowledge that he had worked with his own hands to protect and care for the land and animals he loved. After dinner, John stepped outside one last time. The sky was a canvas of oranges and purples as the sun set behind the hills. The air was cooler now, and the sounds of the night began to emerge. Crickets chirping, an owl hooting in the distance, and the occasional rustle of an animal moving through the trees. John looked out over his land, feeling a quiet pride. He was alone in many ways, but he was not lonely. The land, the animals, and the simple rhythms of life were his companions. As he locked the door and settled into his bed, John felt a sense of peace. Tomorrow would bring more work, more challenges, and more responsibilities. But for now, he could rest. The quiet of the night, the gentle breathing of his animals, and the vastness of the land were enough. He had survived, thrived, and lived another day in a world that demanded strength, patience, and courage. Outside, the wind whispered through the grass and the hills stood tall and silent. John McCall closed his eyes, ready to face whatever the next day would bring, knowing that this land, harsh though it could be, was his home, and he was determined to protect it, no matter what. The next morning, John woke to a different feeling in the air. Something was not right. The sun rose slowly over the hills, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold, but John's heart felt heavy. He had spent many years on this land, and over time he had learned to notice the smallest changes. The smell of the earth, the sound of the wind, and even the behavior of the cattle could tell him more than words ever could. Today, something seemed off. He stepped out of his house and looked over the pasture. At first, everything seemed normal. The cattle grazed quietly, the wind blew through the grass, and the birds flew low across the hills. But as he walked closer to the fence line, he noticed the first unusual sign. A plank in the fence had been broken, splintered as if something heavy had pushed against it. John frowned. He knew the cattle could sometimes damage fences, but this looked different. It wasn't clumsy or accidental. It was deliberate. John moved cautiously along the perimeter of the ranch, inspecting each fence post. As he walked, he saw other strange signs. There were tracks in the soft mud near the creek, hoof prints but not like any of his cattle's. They were too large, uneven, and spread in a way that suggested someone or something had walked hurriedly through the area. His mind raced, trying to think of what could have caused them. He could not imagine a wild animal making tracks this way, and no traveler had passed through recently. He stopped near the creek and knelt to look closely at the ground. The prints were fresh, the mud still soft and wet from the morning dew. A shiver ran down his spine. John had always been a brave man, but even he felt a flicker of fear now. He knew the land, he trusted his instincts, and his instincts were telling him that he was not alone. Something, or someone, had come onto his ranch during the night. John stood up and scanned the hills and trees around him. The forest seemed darker than usual, the shadows stretching longer in the early morning light. The wind carried faint sounds, the rustling of leaves and the snapping of twigs. At first he thought it was the wind moving through the branches, but then he noticed it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. Something was moving out there, watching, waiting. Despite the unease, John tried to stay calm. He knew panic would not help him. He returned to the barn to check on the cattle. They seemed nervous, shifting from one hoof to another, their ears flicking toward the forest. He approached them slowly, speaking in soft, low tones. "Easy now, nothing's wrong." But even as he spoke, he could feel the tension in the air. The animals could sense something was different, and so could he. After feeding the cattle and making sure they had water, John walked to the top of a small hill near the center of the ranch. From here, he could see most of his land. The view was beautiful, rolling hills, a distant creek, and the forest stretching as far as the eye could see. But today, it was eerie. He noticed a dark shape moving near the edge of the forest. It was just a shadow at first, but it moved in a way that did not look like a deer or any other animal he knew. John's heart began to beat faster. He felt a knot of worry tighten in his stomach. He returned to the house briefly to gather some tools, a lantern, a long stick, and a small rifle. John was not a violent man, but he knew he had to protect his property and the animals. Still, he hoped he would not have to use it. He preferred to rely on his knowledge of the land and his experience rather than force. There was a skill in watching, waiting, and understanding, and John believed it could save him. As he stepped outside again, a traveler appeared on the road leading toward his ranch. The man was dusty from the trail and looked tired, but his eyes were sharp and alert. He stopped near the fence and lifted a hand in greeting. John nodded and returned the greeting cautiously. "You own this land?" the traveler asked, his voice low. "John McCall." "You should be careful," he said. "Don't look there." His eyes flicked toward the edge of the woods. "There's trouble nearby. I've seen it before. Some men or animals, you never know. Best to watch yourself." The traveler's warning was real, filled with urgency. John felt a shiver run down his spine. "I appreciate the warning," he said, "but I'll handle it." The man's words echoed in his mind. "Don't look there." He had no idea what it meant, but it made him more alert than ever. He walked back toward the fence line, inspecting every post, every plank, and every corner of the ranch. Nothing seemed out of place at first, but his instincts told him otherwise. Something had come onto the land, and it was not done yet. As the day passed, John noticed more unusual signs. A section of fence was bent in an odd way, as if something large had forced its way through. A small group of his chickens had scattered, feathers on the ground suggesting a predator had passed nearby. But there were no clear tracks of a wild animal, no bare paw prints, no coyote marks. Whatever had been here moved carefully, deliberately, and it left an impression on John that was hard to ignore. By late afternoon, the tension on the ranch grew heavier. The wind picked up, carrying with it the faint smell of smoke from somewhere in the distance. John could hear low sounds coming from the forest, though he could not identify them. The cattle shifted nervously, and he could see the fear in their eyes. John had always been able to calm them, but even they seemed uneasy today. He decided to stay outside for a while longer, walking slowly along the fence line, checking every corner and keeping his eyes on the forest. The sun was low now, casting long shadows across the hills. Every movement in the trees seemed exaggerated in the dim light. John felt the hair on his neck stand up, and he gripped his stick tightly. He did not know what was out there, but he knew it was watching. As evening approached, John returned to the house for dinner, but he did not eat right away. He sat by the window, looking out at the forest and the hills beyond. The traveler's warning played over and over in his mind. Don't look there. He did not understand it, but he trusted his instincts more than anything. He knew he had to be careful. The land was his home, but it was also unpredictable. The night fell quietly, yet the ranch did not feel peaceful. The sounds of the forest were louder now, the rustling of leaves, the occasional snap of a branch, and the distant howl of an animal. John made sure all the gates were closed and the fences were secure. He checked on the cattle one last time, ensuring they were safe in the lower pasture near the barn. Before going to bed, John stepped outside once more. The sky was dark, filled with stars that shone brightly above the hills. The wind whispered through the grass and trees. In the distance, a shadow moved near the edge of the forest. John froze, holding his breath. He could not tell what it was, but he felt the weight of its presence. His heart beat fast, but he did not panic. He had faced many challenges on this land before, but this was different. Something was out there, and it was watching him. Finally, John went inside, locking the door behind him. He sat by the fire, the warmth seeping into his tired body. He thought about the day, the strange tracks, the broken fences, the traveler's warning. He knew the land had its dangers, but this felt new, unfamiliar. He resolved to stay alert and to watch carefully. Tomorrow would bring another day, another chance to see what was out there. As John lay down to sleep, he could not shake the feeling of being observed. The ranch that had always been his safe haven now felt uncertain. The night was quiet, yet heavy with anticipation. John closed his eyes, knowing that the days ahead would test his courage, his instincts, and his understanding of the land he had loved for so long. The forest loomed silently, holding its secrets in the dark, and John McCall understood that the quiet ranch life he had known was about to change forever. The morning sun rose slowly, spilling light over the hills and fields of John McCall's ranch. The air was crisp, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth and grass. Despite the bright day, John felt a tension that he could not shake. Last night he had sensed a presence in the forest, something watching him silently. The memory of the traveler's warning, "Don't look there," echoed in his mind. Today he knew he had to find out what was happening, but he also had to be careful. He dressed quickly, putting on his worn boots and sturdy coat. He grabbed his rifle, more for comfort than for actual use, and stepped outside. The cattle were calm, grazing quietly in the early light, but he noticed that they occasionally lifted their heads and stared toward the forest. Animals always sensed danger before humans did, and their nervousness confirmed John's fears. Something had been in the woods, and it was still nearby. John decided to start his investigation near the edge of the forest. He walked slowly along the fence line, carefully observing each step. The morning dew made the grass slippery, but he moved steadily, using his knowledge of the land to guide him. He examined the broken fence plank again, noticing the deep grooves in the wood. It was not a random break. Someone or something had forced it open, deliberately creating a gap. He frowned, trying to imagine who could have done it. As he walked, John found more clues. There were footprints, some human, some unfamiliar. They led from the forest to the pasture and then back toward the hills. The prints were fresh, clearly made within the last few hours. He knelt to inspect them, tracing the shapes with his hand. Whoever had been here had walked carefully, almost cautiously, as if they did not want to be noticed. That thought made John's stomach tight. He realized he was dealing with someone who knew the land, someone experienced. He followed the tracks cautiously, keeping his eyes on the forest as he moved. The shadows shifted between the trees, and he could hear faint rustling in the underbrush. His heart beat faster, but he reminded himself to stay calm. Panic would not help him. He was a rancher, a man who had lived off the land for decades. He knew patience, observation, and careful planning were often more powerful than force. After a while, John reached a small clearing near the creek. The tracks converged here, and he noticed something else: broken branches, as if someone had pushed through the trees roughly. The undergrowth was disturbed, and he could see marks on the ground that suggested movement in a hurry. For a moment, he thought he saw a shadow move between the trees, but when he blinked, it was gone. He stood still, listening. The forest was alive with sound, the chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves, the faint gurgle of the creek. But beneath these normal noises, there was something different, something that made the hairs on his neck stand up. A soft, deliberate movement, almost like someone pacing or watching him from a distance. He tightened his grip on his rifle and took a cautious step forward. Suddenly, a branch snapped louder than before. John froze. He could hear a soft whisper of movement, then silence again. His mind raced. Who or what could be out there? The traveler's warning returned to him. Don't look there. John did not fully understand the meaning, but he knew it was serious. He had been cautious so far, but now he realized he might be walking into something far larger than he had imagined. He decided to circle back toward the house, moving slowly and carefully. Every sound seemed louder in the quiet morning. The wind had picked up slightly, making the trees sway and the grass ripple. As he walked, he noticed more unusual signs: scratches on tree trunks, disturbed soil, and small piles of leaves that had been moved aside. Whoever, or whatever, had been here was methodical. They had left a trail for him to follow, almost as if daring him to investigate further. By late morning, John had reached the barn, but he could not rest. He felt a strong need to understand what was happening. He began to inspect the perimeter of the barn, looking for anything unusual. That's when he noticed it, a small pile of trampled hay near the back door. The hay had been pushed aside carefully, and there were faint footprints around it. He crouched and examined them. They were human, but the shoes were unfamiliar, heavy, and sturdy. Someone had been inside his barn. A cold wave of realization passed over him. His ranch, his safe home, had been violated. He felt a mixture of fear and determination. He would not be intimidated, but he had to act wisely. John began planning. He decided to set up a small observation point near the barn, where he could watch the forest and the edge of the pasture without being seen. He gathered some wood, stacked it carefully, and climbed to a small platform he had used before for hunting birds. From here, he could see most of his land and the surrounding forest. Hours passed as John waited. He stayed perfectly still, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. He could hear the faint sounds of the wind, the creek, and the occasional bird. Everything seemed quiet, yet he could not shake the feeling that something was watching him. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed a figure moving slowly along the forest line. It was far away, but clearly human. They paused, looking toward the barn, then disappeared into the trees again. John's heart raced. He did not know the figure's intentions, but he knew he had to be prepared. He stayed in his observation spot, noting every movement and sound. He realized that the person or people were exploring, perhaps scouting his land. It was not an attack yet, but it could be. He had to be ready for anything. As the afternoon wore on, John made another discovery. Near the creek, he saw a small collection of tools and supplies left behind. Someone had been working quietly, leaving only a few signs of their presence. John studied the items carefully. They were simple, practical tools: ropes, a small lantern, and a knife. The person was clever, cautious, and experienced in moving through the wilderness without being noticed. That thought both worried and fascinated him. Whoever they were skilled, and that meant they could be dangerous if provoked. He spent the rest of the day moving carefully around the ranch, making subtle changes to secure his property. He repaired the broken fence, double-checked the barn doors, and made sure the cattle were safe. He did not want to make noise or draw attention to himself. He learned long ago that being patient and observant often allowed a man to outsmart even the cleverest intruder. As evening approached, the wind shifted and the shadows grew long across the hills. John climbed back to his observation platform, watching the forest and pasture. He saw movement again, a shadow darting behind a tree, but this time it felt different. The figure seemed aware of him, almost testing his patience and skill. John held his breath, staying perfectly still. He did not want to reveal his presence until he knew more. The sun set slowly, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The forest became darker and the figure vanished. John climbed down from the platform and returned to the house. He was exhausted but alert. His mind raced with questions. Who had been on his land? Why had they come? And what did the traveler mean by "don't look there"? He did not have answers yet, but he knew one thing: his quiet life on the ranch was changing. Something was coming, something that would test his courage, his intelligence, and his connection to the land he loved so much. Before going to bed, John checked on the cattle one last time. They were calm now, grazing quietly in the fading light. The barn doors were secure and the fences repaired. Yet, a sense of unease lingered in the air. He could feel it in his bones. The forest held secrets, and those secrets were moving closer to his home. John knew he could not ignore them. As he lay in bed that night, John stared at the ceiling, listening to the quiet sounds of the ranch. The wind whispered through the grass, the creek flowed gently, and the distant call of an owl echoed in the hills. But beneath these familiar sounds there was something different, something almost alive, watching, waiting. John closed his eyes, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges. He would have to face them with courage, patience, and wisdom. The ranch, once peaceful and predictable, now held mysteries that demanded attention. John McCall understood that his life, his home, and his freedom were at stake. The quiet of the Wild West had been broken, and the coming days would reveal whether he could protect everything he held dear. The morning was quiet, but John McCall felt an unusual tension in the air. The sun rose slowly, casting a warm glow over the hills and pasture, but the light did little to ease the unease in his chest. For days he had noticed strange signs around his ranch, broken fences, unusual tracks, and the feeling that he was being watched. Today he had decided he could no longer ignore it. He had to find out who or what had been trespassing on his land. He dressed quickly and carefully, putting on his boots and coat, and grabbed his rifle, though he hoped he would not need it. John had always preferred to rely on his intelligence and experience rather than force. He stepped outside and looked over the pasture. The cattle were grazing quietly, but their ears twitched at every sound. Even they seemed aware that something unusual was happening. John made sure the gates were secure and that the barn doors were locked. He had prepared as much as he could. Walking slowly toward the forest edge, he scanned every shadow, every tree, and every movement. He knew the land better than anyone, and he trusted his instincts. The tracks he had seen before were still visible in the soft dirt, human footprints mixed with unfamiliar animal prints. Whoever had been here was skilled and careful, moving quietly and deliberately. John's mind raced as he followed the trail. After a while, he reached the clearing near the creek, the same spot where he had noticed broken branches and disturbed undergrowth before. He knelt to examine the ground, noticing fresh footprints that had not been there the day before. Someone had returned overnight. The prints led deeper into the forest, and John realized that he would have to go farther than he had ever dared. His pulse quickened, but he did not hesitate. He had to know the truth. He moved slowly through the trees, careful not to make a sound. Sunlight filtered through the branches, creating shifting patterns on the forest floor. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made him tense, but he reminded himself to stay calm. He was alone, but he was not afraid of the land. He was afraid of what or who might be hiding within it. Suddenly, he saw movement ahead. A shadow darted between the trees, and his heart skipped a beat. He crouched low, hiding behind a fallen log, and watched. There in the small clearing ahead was a group of men. They were gathered around something. He could not see clearly from his hiding spot, but it looked like stolen supplies and a few of his tools. They were talking quietly, their voices low, but John could hear snippets. One of the men laughed softly. "This place is quiet, too quiet. Easy pickings." These were not ordinary travelers or hunters. They were intruders, taking advantage of the isolation of his ranch. His hands gripped the rifle tightly, though he forced himself to stay hidden. He needed a plan. He could not rush in blindly. He had to observe, understand their movements, and choose the right moment. The men began moving slowly toward the barn. John realized that if they reached the animals, the cattle and chickens could be in danger. He took a deep breath, steadying his nerves. He had faced challenges before, but this was different. This was a direct threat to his home and livelihood. He needed to act carefully. He decided to use his knowledge of the land. John had spent decades on this ranch and knew every path, every hill, and every hidden spot. He moved quietly along a hidden trail, keeping low behind trees and bushes. He circled around the men, making sure they did not notice him. As he got closer, he could see their faces and hear their whispers more clearly. They were confident but careless. They had underestimated the land and its owner. John crept closer and noticed one man carrying a lantern. The soft light illuminated part of the clearing, revealing some of the stolen tools and supplies. John's mind worked quickly. He needed to separate them, slow them down, and protect his animals. He looked around and found a small pile of rocks. Quietly, he picked one up and threw it far enough to make a loud clatter away from his hiding spot. The sound drew the attention of the men. "What was that?" one of them asked, moving toward the noise. John held his breath, remaining hidden. The man disappeared into the trees, leaving the others distracted. He took this opportunity to move even closer, planning to use the cover of the forest to surprise them if necessary. He could see the back of the barn now and noticed that the men were approaching cautiously. They were skilled, but John was ready. Suddenly, a branch snapped near the forest edge. One of the men turned sharply toward it, frowning. John froze, heart pounding. He realized they were aware that something or someone was watching. He could not afford to hesitate. Using the element of surprise, he stepped out from behind a large tree, holding his rifle. "Stop right there," he called, his voice firm and steady. The men froze, startled. None of them had expected to see him. John could see the surprise and fear on their faces. He did not raise the rifle further, he simply held it as a warning. His presence, combined with his confidence and knowledge of the land, gave him an advantage. One of the men laughed nervously. "Looks like we have company," he said. John did not reply. He moved slowly, keeping his eyes on them. "Leave my property," he said firmly. "Now take your things and go." The men looked at each other, unsure of what to do. They had not expected the rancher to confront them so directly. After a moment, one of them muttered something and gestured to the others. They began moving back toward the forest, picking up their supplies quickly. John watched carefully, making sure they left the area completely. Once they disappeared among the trees, John waited a few more minutes before lowering the rifle. His heart was still racing, but he felt a sense of relief. He had protected his land without a fight, relying on his intelligence and courage. He knew that the men might return, but he had sent a clear message. His ranch was not an easy target. John carefully inspected the clearing and the barn area. Nothing was missing and the cattle were safe. He repaired the small damage they had caused and reinforced the fences. Every movement was deliberate and careful, ensuring that no further surprises awaited him. The experience had left him alert, but also proud. He had faced a real threat and handled it wisely. As the afternoon passed, John thought about the warning from the traveler. "Don't look there." He realized that it had been a caution, not just about danger, but about preparation and observation. The traveler had understood the risks of the land better than he had expected. John made a mental note to remain vigilant, knowing that the Wild West was full of challenges, some visible and some hidden. By evening, John returned to his house, exhausted but satisfied. He checked on the cattle one last time, ensuring they were safe in the barn. The shadows of the hills grew long and the forest became darker, but the ranch was quiet again. He prepared a simple meal, sitting by the fire and reflecting on the day. The events had tested his courage, his patience, and his understanding of the land. He had succeeded, but he knew that more challenges could come. Before going to bed, John stepped outside to look at the stars. The sky was clear and the night was calm, yet the memory of the men in the forest lingered. He could still feel their presence, even though they were gone. The land had tested him and he had responded wisely, but John understood that this was only the beginning. The Wild West was full of surprises, and he would have to stay alert every day to protect his home, his animals, and his way of life. As he lay down to sleep, John felt a quiet pride. He had faced danger directly and had come through it safely, but he also knew the lesson of the day. Courage alone was not enough. Observation, patience, and knowledge of the land were just as important. The forest still held its secrets, and John McCall was determined to understand them, to protect his ranch, and to face whatever came next with steady hands and a careful mind. The night was quiet, but the hills and the forest seemed alive with possibility. John closed his eyes, ready for the days ahead, knowing that the Wild West could be both beautiful and unpredictable, and that he had the strength to face it all. The morning after the confrontation with the intruders, John McCall woke early as usual. The sun had just begun to rise, painting the hills with soft shades of gold and pink. The air was crisp and quiet, but John could feel a lingering tension in the atmosphere. His ranch was calm for now, but he knew better than to let his guard down. The events of the previous day had changed everything. He had faced danger directly, but the forest and hills still held mysteries he had yet to understand. John stepped outside, taking a deep breath of the cool morning air. The cattle grazed peacefully in the pasture, the chickens clucked softly, and the wind whispered gently through the grass. At first glance, everything seemed normal, but John knew that appearances could be deceiving. The forest, with its dark shadows and hidden paths, had tested him once, and it could do so again. He walked slowly along the fence line, inspecting every post and gate. The repairs he had made the day before were holding well, and the barn was secure. As he moved around the ranch, John reflected on what had happened. The intruders had been clever and cautious, moving quietly and leaving only subtle signs of their presence. They had tested him, perhaps to see if the ranch was an easy target, but John had remained calm, observant, and patient. He had used his knowledge of the land and the behavior of the intruders to protect his home without confrontation. That realization gave him a sense of pride. He had faced a real threat and had succeeded without escalating it into danger. After checking on the animals, John decided to explore the edge of the forest carefully. He wanted to understand the paths the intruders had taken and see if there were any hidden signs he had missed. Moving slowly, he followed faint tracks through the soft earth. The forest was alive with sound, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds, and the faint gurgle of the creek, but he remained focused, aware of every movement. As he moved deeper into the trees, John noticed something unusual. A small pile of items had been left behind: a lantern, a coil of rope, and some old tools. He examined them carefully, understanding that these were not just ordinary items. They were part of the intruder's plan, perhaps forgotten or intentionally left to distract him. John carefully collected the items, deciding to keep them as evidence and to study them later. Each object told a story, revealing the skill and intent of those who had trespassed. John spent the morning moving cautiously through the forest, observing the land and taking note of the subtle signs left behind. Broken branches, disturbed soil, and faint footprints guided him along the paths the intruders had taken. He felt a sense of respect for the people who had moved so carefully, but he also knew that he could not allow anyone to threaten his ranch again. His mind worked quickly, planning ways to make the property even more secure while staying alert to the surrounding environment. By midday, John returned to the barn to check on the cattle and chickens once more. Everything was in order. The animals had settled back into their routine, and there were no signs of further disturbances. He took a moment to sit on the steps of the barn, resting and reflecting. He thought about the traveler who had warned him, "Don't look there." John realized that the traveler's words were not just a warning about the intruders, but also a lesson about awareness and preparation. In the Wild West, danger could come in many forms, and the ability to notice, understand, and act wisely was just as important as courage. After a simple lunch, John returned to his observation platform near the barn. He wanted to keep watch over the ranch for the remainder of the afternoon. From this vantage point, he could see the hills, the forest edge, and the pasture. The view was calming, yet he remained vigilant. He could see the way the sunlight shifted across the trees, creating long shadows, and he listened carefully to every sound: the faint rustle of leaves, the distant call of a hawk, the soft trickle of water from the creek. As the afternoon passed, John noticed subtle changes in the land. Small movements among the trees suggested the presence of wildlife, but nothing unusual. He realized that the land had returned to its normal rhythm, at least for now. This realization brought him a sense of relief, but he did not allow himself to relax completely. The events of the past days had reminded him that even a peaceful ranch could be vulnerable. He resolved to remain alert and prepared, understanding that vigilance was the key to safety. Later in the day, John decided to improve the ranch's defenses further. He reinforced the fences, repaired the barn doors, and cleared paths to make observation easier. Each task was done carefully, with attention to detail. He moved quietly and deliberately, understanding that preparation was as important as confrontation. The land had tested him, but he had learned from it. Every repair, every observation, and every careful movement strengthened his connection to the ranch and his ability to protect it. As the sun began to set, John took a moment to walk along the top of a small hill overlooking the pasture. The sky was painted with brilliant shades of orange, pink, and purple. The hills stretched endlessly, and the forest cast long, dark shadows across the land. John felt a deep sense of pride and accomplishment. He had faced danger, observed carefully, and protected his home. The ranch was more secure than ever, and he had learned valuable lessons about awareness, patience, and courage. He returned to the house as the first stars appeared in the night sky. The ranch was quiet, and the animals were settling down for the evening. John prepared a simple meal and sat by the fire, reflecting on the past days. He thought about the intruders, the traveler's warning, and his own instincts. He understood now that living on the ranch required more than strength. It required observation, patience, and respect for the land. Every action had consequences, and every decision could affect the safety of his home and animals. Before going to bed, John stepped outside once more. The night was clear, and the stars shone brightly above the hills. The wind moved gently through the grass, and the forest seemed calm. Yet John remained alert, aware that the land could change quickly. He walked quietly among the fences and gates, ensuring everything was secure. The experience had taught him that preparation and vigilance were as important as courage. As he lay down to sleep, John reflected on his journey. The ranch had always been his home, a place of peace and hard work. But it had also been a place of lessons, challenges, and growth. He had faced intruders, observed carefully, and protected everything he held dear. He understood that life on the ranch, much like life itself, required a balance of strength, wisdom, and patience. John's thoughts wandered to the traveler's warning once more. Don't look there. He realized that the message had been about more than just danger. It had been about perspective. Sometimes, the unseen challenges in life required careful observation, understanding, and patience. By staying alert and respecting the land, he had managed to protect his home without escalating the situation. The lesson was clear. Wisdom and caution were as valuable as courage in facing the unknown. The night deepened, and John finally allowed himself to rest. The ranch was quiet. The stars shone brightly, and the wind whispered softly through the grass. He knew that tomorrow might bring new challenges, but he felt prepared. The land had tested him, and he had grown stronger, wiser, and more confident in his ability to protect his home. He understood now that life in the Wild West was full of surprises, and that success required both courage and careful observation. As John drifted into sleep, he felt a deep sense of connection to his ranch. The hills, the forest, the cattle, and even the quiet sounds of the night, all were part of his world, his responsibility, and his life. He had faced fear, observed danger, and acted wisely. The lessons of the past days would stay with him forever, guiding his actions and decisions in the days to come. By morning, John knew he would rise again, face the challenges of the ranch, and continue to live with awareness and courage. The Wild West could be unpredictable, but he was ready. He had learned that vigilance, patience, and respect for the land were the keys to safety and success. And most importantly, he had learned that even in the face of uncertainty, a calm mind, careful observation, and thoughtful action could overcome any challenge. John McCall's ranch returned to its quiet rhythm. The cattle grazed peacefully, the chickens clucked softly, and the wind whispered gently through the hills. Life was hard, but it was honest, rewarding, and filled with lessons. John had faced danger, observed carefully, and protected what mattered most. He had grown stronger, wiser, and more connected to the land than ever before. And as the sun rose over the hills once more, John knew that he was ready for whatever the Wild West might bring next.